Hello, my name is Al Schriesheim. I am the Director Emeritus of Argonne National Laboratory. I'm the President of the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, an organization whose mission is to raise the awareness of the importance of science and technology in our society, critical issues, science policy, and in order to do that, we run events such as this in the evening, generally, some on Saturday afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you here for this one. My role tonight, in addition to saying who we are and encouraging you to fill out the questionnaire that you received inside this little folder that asks you to comment on the meeting, and also asks you to, if you would, say what it is that you are interested in that fits into that mission that we have, so we can consider that. And I also encourage you to become members because we are a membership organization. My role, as I said, is to introduce the person who will introduce the speakers. And that is Bob Martin. Bob is the Watson Armour III Curator of Biological Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the Field Museum. Bob's vita is here, and I'm not going to read it, certainly. You can read it. He spent 10 years, he has spent 10 years, been at the Field Museum for 10 years, former provost, and well known in the field. So I would like to introduce Bob. Bob?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening. And I'm also delighted for several reasons to have the honor to introduce tonight's presentations. Firstly, because this organization, C2ST, has really made a major presence as regards science in Chicago. And so anything I can do to help, I gladly do. The second point is that I happen to live in Lincoln Park, just across from the zoo. And it's really nice to know that there's a scientific powerhouse just across the way in the Lester Fisher Ape House. So it's really nice to be able to introduce the two people who are responsible for that powerhouse and its achievements at the moment. But the other thing is that I did my original training back in the midst of time in animal behavior. And at that time, we were primarily concerned with objective description of behavior. We were observing animals and trying to record what was going on as scientifically as possible. And we began to get into exploring mechanisms. But things have moved on tremendously. We've now got to the point where we can begin to ask serious questions about how animals think, what goes on in the minds of other animals. And the problem is we can't ask them. And so it's up to us to come up with clever ways to explore what is going on inside the minds of other animals, particularly our closest relatives, such as the chimpanzee. And as you can see from the illustration up there, a book with the same title as the presentations tonight came out last year, 2010, edited by our two presenters tonight, Dr. Elizabeth Lonsdorf, who's director of the Lester Fisher Center at the zoo, and Dr. Steve Ross, who is the assistant director. And they were actually joined by a Japanese specialist, Tetsuro Matsuzawa, and the three of them put this book together. So if you want to get into depth on this issue, I can thoroughly recommend that book. By my count, it has 28 contributions, and how you keep that number of authors in line without an electric cattle prod, I have no idea. But it must have been quite a job. I'd like to hear from Liz and Steve afterwards what it was like. Not something I would take on easily. And so tonight, they're going to present to us the gist of this topic, exploring the mind of a chimpanzee. And Liz did her original degree at Duke University and then went on to the University of Minnesota to do her PhD through the Jane Goodall Center there. And Steve is truly international. If you speak 3 languages, I think you would call trilingual. So if you've had 3 different countries in the course of your further education, I suppose you're tri-educational. And he started off with his BSc degree at the University of Guelph in Canada, and then here at the University of Chicago did his master's. And just last November, he did his PhD at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And so he has really been around in the scientific scene. And so what we're going to hear from Liz and from Steve in a nutshell is the contents of this research. And you couldn't be hearing it from 2 better people. It's a privilege for me to introduce them.
Wow, thanks, Bob. That was a great and flattering introduction. Steve and I are working on this tag team approach to this presentation, so you'll see us kind of bouncing back and forth to the microphone as different topics come up, so bear with us on that. And yeah, we are really excited that you all are here tonight, and we're excited to talk about this topic. This is a topic we've spent a lot of time, as Bob alluded to, thinking about and wrangling other people to think about. So hopefully we will, enlighten you as to some of the hot topics in this research, and also draw your attention to the fact that a lot of research in this area is going on right here in your hometown in Chicago at Lincoln Park Zoo. So we can get started. First, just to orient us to the critter we're talking about chimpanzees. These are, as Bob said, our closest living relative. In the wild, they live across equatorial Africa in reduced numbers now, unfortunately. They live in complex social communities. They live until about 50 or 60 years old. We don't quite know yet, because the longest field studies that have been ongoing have been conducted by this woman, Jane Goodall, and the Jane Goodall study at Gombe National Park, which is where I work, is just in its 50th year this year. And we have individuals that have been there and were youngsters when Jane first started. So the lifespan at this point in the wild, we're still figuring that out, if you can believe that. Typically, chimps give birth to 1 baby. That baby stays with their mom until they're they nurse until they're about 4 to 5 years old, and they stay with their mom until about 10. So that's a very primary relationship in chimpanzees. As I said, they have these complex social dynamics, which we'll get into a bit later. They're omnivorous, so they eat everything. These are kind of things that will come up later in our discussion. So these are all things we know about chimpanzees because of the research started at Gombe by Jane Goodall, who's pictured here, and then other field studies that kind of came out of the area as Jane started her study in 1960. So the study of chimpanzees does have a rich history now. I mean, it's 50 years in the wild. It's even longer in captive settings. And there's been some previous works that have tried to compile kind of the current state of the field of chimpanzee research. The very first one, and I should mention that act of compiling the current research actually has a long history in Chicago. So the very first book and attempt to do this was a conference that was done in 1986 here in Chicago. And an edited volume that came out of that called Understanding Chimpanzees was published shortly thereafter. Those people decided to meet 5 years later and kind of update the field. And then the next book, Chimpanzee Cultures, was published out of that effort. And so when Steve and I were approached several years ago and said, hey, Chicago Connection, chimpanzees, you guys are chimp experts, why don't you guys do the next conference? We were like, well, but that sounds hard. But with some pressure from some significant alpha males, we took on the challenge, and we did host, we decided to make it a topical conference about the advances that have been made in understanding the mind of the chimpanzee. As Bob mentioned, this is something that the technology is really just getting there to try and understand. So we gathered a group of about 25, 28 people that were experts in one way or the other on this topic, and we did a couple things that were unique from the previous conferences. One, we mixed alpha males with beta males, as we would say, so we had some very well-known, well-established primatologists presenting their research, but we also had quite a few, about half and half younger researchers who were just starting out but were making new discoveries of merit on their own. And we also did a mix of field and captive research. So these were areas where people didn't overlap a lot in talking to each other, and we thought it would be good to bring those together. So we brought together this group of folks and wrangled them with cattle prods and wine and various other things that it took to wrangle them, and had our conference a couple years ago. And then began the process of wrangling them afterwards to contribute to this edited volume that Bob mentioned. So in this volume, what we tried to do was examine the major current topics of interest in the field of chimpanzee cognition. And what we want to do today is go over those with you, kind of introduce you to those various hot topics, but also let you know how researchers, some of whom are here tonight, working with Steve and I, and our group is exploring some of these issues at Lincoln Park Zoo, because I think a lot of people don't realize often the stuff that's going on right in their hometown. So I'm going to turn it to Steve.
Both Elizabeth and Bob mentioned that there's obviously this long history studying chimpanzees. They're immensely interesting to both the scientific and the lay public. I think you'll see chimpanzees and news about chimpanzees quite frequently in media, on television, and in the news. And what has been done over the course of several decades, of course, is to understand more about how they behave. That's what Jane Goodall did. She spent a lot of time watching chimpanzees and understanding, by watching them, what they were doing, and a lot about their social structure, etc. What's come much more recently is, as Elizabeth alluded to, the technology that allows us to get even further, beyond what we can see and what they do, and a little bit further into what we're calling their cognitive mechanisms. What's going on behind the curtain? What are the cognitive mechanisms behind some of the behaviors and some of the social strategies that they use? And that's one of the very first topics that we address in the book. And you know, the way we're able to do this, at least very recently, is to use technology. And this gives us the ability to move beyond what we can observe with our eyes, and then to be able to ask questions of the apes by giving them this platform. It's a little different than traditional sort of language-based research that you may have heard about, sign language research and so on. This gives them almost a neutral platform in which we can interact with them and ask them all sorts of questions. And what scientists like ourselves are interested in is, how do chimpanzees perceive the world around them? Their environment is made up of so many different factors, either in the wild or in captive settings. And we want to know how they use those bits of information, how they categorize those bits of information. And quite often we can use things like computer touchscreens to get at something like that. So I'm going to show you a quick video. This is a young chimpanzee who lives at the Primate Research Institute in Japan. Was working with Tetsuro Matsuzawa, which is our co-editor of the book. And here we're interested in studying how a chimpanzee is able to put discrete items in a particular order. Now, on the surface, this might seem like an examination of something like counting, but really it's much more about how chimpanzees are able to identify and order discrete items. That is, how do they understand the relationship between particular items? So this is how it's done. You can see what appears on the screen are 9 digits, okay, from 1 to 9. I believe they're all there. Yeah. And it took me a while. Believe me, the chimps are a lot faster at this than I am. But what the task is that this young chimp has to identify the order of these digits, okay? And he has been given a short range of digits, maybe just 1 and 2 originally, and that string of digits has been increased over time, such as he's able to learn the relationship between the digits. So I hope, given the educational level of our audience tonight, that you're able to look at those digits and identify which one comes first, which comes next, all the way till 9. If anyone can't do that, yeah, all right, then have another glass of wine. But, so let's watch to see how Ayumu does. It's actually not overly difficult for him. He's able to find those quite easily without many mistakes at all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this really showed something. Again, this is not necessarily counting. This isn't a test of whether he understands quantity of those digits, but he understands the relationship between these different individual items. So this was a really neat demonstration of how chimpanzees can perceive different elements of their environment. These are digits on a screen, but they might represent something very different. A lot of what chimpanzees do in the wild or in captive settings is to do particular behaviors that might come in a particular order. You might even conjecture that these types of skills are the basis for language. Language has very specific syntax. You have to know this comes before this, comes before this. And so that's the type of demonstration that chimpanzees have been shown to be very capable of. But what might be even more interesting is this. You'll see very quickly if you were watching that the certain number of digits appear on the screen. In this case, it's not all the numbers from 1 to 9, but very quickly they turn to these identical opaque shapes. Now it's a very different test. Now they're interested not only if the chimpanzees are able to recognize the relationships between those units, but if they were able to recognize them before they turned into these, these identical shapes. And so it's also a test of short-term memory. So for those of you who are watching, would you be able to put those squares in any order? Those who can, put up your hand. Because I have a job for you. Because let's see how Ayumu does. He has problems because of his fingernails not registering on the touchscreen, but eventually he gets it, and you can see the little treat appears in the lower right-hand corner, and he gets it. Look how fast he's able to recognize that string of items. Anyone do that? Which one's next? This one? This one? Oh, can you see my mouse? Yeah. Let's see. Very good. So we know someone at least is capable of 2 numbers. So there's a number of different tasks that chimpanzees have been able to do on touchscreens like this. And they've proven themselves not only capable of doing things that humans are able to do. You often hear of people asking, how smart are chimpanzees? Are they as smart as a 2-year-old, as smart as a 3-year-old? What's been interesting here is that chimpanzees have proven to be able to do certain cognitive tasks, especially those involving short-term memory, at levels that no human are able to do. In fact, the story goes that they had brought in some of the UK's memory experts, these guys that apparently there's contests in the UK. Bob, maybe you can help me out here. That they test their memory, and they're unable to do these tasks at the rate that Ayumu is able to do. So it really doesn't become a case of are they as smart as humans, are they able to conduct these tasks as well as humans, but what skills they actually have evolved to be able to perform over time. Elizabeth mentioned, of course, that these studies are not only happening in Japan at sort of university research settings, but what's really neat is just down the road at our free zoo in Lincoln Park, we're doing these level of studies. In fact, we have both chimpanzees and gorillas that are involved with cognition studies, involved in using touchscreens, and we're able to do some of these types of investigations. In this particular video, which admittedly is a little fuzzy, this is a chimpanzee doing some ordering, sequencing work on a touchscreen, and now actually these types of tasks are available. You can come to the zoo and see them on public display, and you can watch some of the chimpanzees and gorillas do these sort of things. Here, this chimpanzee is putting not digits together, but these symbols, which have a predetermined order, and again, he gets it right, he reaches down, sometimes he drops to the ground, takes a break to pick up a blueberry. But again, these types of tasks that are modeled after Dr. Matsuzawa's tasks, we're able to do these types of scientific studies in a zoo setting. This is also interesting to note here that all of these tasks that, well, these are, we have a gorilla video here as well, showing that it's not the chimpanzees themselves only that are able to do these types of tasks, but a number of different apes, and we're really one of the only places that are doing these touchscreen experiments with apes. All of these studies are actually completely voluntary. It's up to them whether they want to participate or not. But I can tell you with great frequency they do. It's quite challenging, it's fun for them, they get these little treats, but I think most especially they enjoy sort of the mental challenge of it. And that in itself says something about the link between sort of mental stimulation and animal welfare.
So one of the other areas that's continually really a hot topic in chimpanzee research is tool use, and flowing out of that, this idea of culture. So one of the very first observations that made Jane Goodall famous was a chimpanzee named David Greybeard making a tool out of a piece of vegetation and putting it into an above-ground termite mound. The termites would attack and cling to the tool, and then she pulled it out, and she called this termite fishing. And this was kind of a profound change in our thoughts about the capabilities of animals in the wild, because previously to that, man was known as man the tool maker, and animals were different. They couldn't do that. So what was fascinating about what David Greybeard did was that he not only used a tool, I mean, you know, we know that animals can use tools to bust open their food and things like that, but he made a tool, he fashioned a tool for a specific purpose. So since that initial discovery, which was 1964, you know, tool use studies have just exploded all over chimpanzee field sites in the wild and in captive settings. And we now know that chimps use more tools for more purposes than any other any other animal besides humans. And several years ago, kind of the chimp field researchers got together and kind of cataloged, you know, do your guys do this? Do they termite fish? Do your guys nut crack? Do your guys do this? You know, if they don't nut crack, is it because the nuts aren't there or because they don't have the proper stones? You know, what does this look like? Why are there differences and similarities in some of these chimpanzee research sites? And when they compiled all of this data, what they found was that there were 39 kind of candidate behaviors that existed in some chimpanzee communities, but were absent in others, where there wasn't a nice, clean, ecological explanation for why a behavior was either present or absent. For example, chimps in the east don't nut crack, chimps in the west do, but it's not because the chimps in the east don't have nuts or stone tools, they just don't do it. And so the chimpanzee researchers termed this chimpanzee culture, and proposed that it was analogous to the fact that you might eat your rice with a fork and our friends and colleagues in Japan eat their rice with a chopstick. There's no good ecological reason for that, it's just how it's done based on where you're brought up and who brings you up. It's what we think of in humans in some terms as culture. Well, people kind of freaked out about this and said, you chimp researchers are clearly spending too much time in the bush, now you think your animals have culture, and what is the Tanzanian white lightning that you guys have been drinking? But since then, there's been much more consistent and real quantitative measurement of these behavioral differences from community to community. And although the use of the term culture is still debated by people that like to use it in a different way, it's certainly acknowledged that there are behavioral differences among chimpanzee communities that are learned socially from the people you grew up with, rather than passed down genetically. So this is, again, getting to Bob's idea of, we're not just able to describe behavior now, we're actually able to get at some of the mechanisms of how these behaviors arise and why they stick around in a community and why communities might be different by taking this kind of comparative approach. And so this is, there were several talks at our conference. It's still a very exciting topic, both how these chimpanzees use tools to solve problems in their environment, whether their environment is the field or whether it's in captive settings, and the differences seen between communities, and what does that mean for behavioral variability and culture and cognition. Let me get my thing here. So what I want to show you now is pretty hot off the press. This is one of the field sites that Lincoln Park Zoo has researchers stationed at is called the Gualogo Triangle in the Republic of Congo. We have full-time staff there. And this is in the very center of Africa. It's very hard to get to. It's very remote. And the chimpanzees there have basically never been studied in depth. So we know a lot about eastern chimpanzees, we know a lot about western chimpanzees, and we know almost nothing about Central African chimpanzees. And when our researchers, Dave and Cricket, went out there, what they found is that these chimps are crazy tool users. They do tool use like nobody has ever seen before. And they've been slowly documenting this. They've been out at the field site for about 10 years now. And one of the coolest things, and it's really in here just because it's cool, that they've documented is this honey pounding. So this video, again, it's a little bit grainy. That's because this chimp is about 100 feet up in a tree. She's got a baby clinging to her belly. You can see there, this chimp is named Maya. And what she's doing is, whoops, I'm not getting this to play. Oops. Here we go. What she's doing is grabbing a big club. These are stingless bees, so it reduces the risk a little bit, but she still is high up on the tree with a baby on her belly and pounding over and over and over again at this bee nest to get just minuscule amounts of honey. Apparently these Central African chimps have a huge sweet tooth because this is a really energetically expensive and risky behavior. I mean, she's got one hand and 1 foot on the tree, 1 foot on the tool, one hand going for it, and then a baby clinging on for dear life. But these are the types of behaviors that even now that chimps have been studied in the field for 50 years, we're still finding that they can do new things and they can attack new problems in new ways. This is actually some of my own field video. This is the very first tool use behavior that Jane discovered. It's called termite fishing that I described before. This is a female named Gremlin and her twins Golden and Glitter. And when I was studying this behavior in the wild, what I was very interested in is how this behavior developed. Later. How this behavior develops in the wild, and we're not going to start that one yet. And what I found was that there were some very similar developmental findings to what we see in human children. So if many of you probably have kids, with a behavior like termite fishing, where it's a very fine motor skill requiring lots of attention and kind of patience, the young female chimpanzees blew the males out of the water. They learned this skill about 2 years quicker than the males. Now, I have one of each. I have a daughter and a son. And I can tell you that at home, my results are exactly the same. So the females at age 2 were really intent on what their mom was doing. They were watching very closely, as you saw both of those little girls doing, watching their mom really intently. Boys are off, turning pirouettes, kicking their mom in the head, just kind of, we call it dorking about. I mean, they were just kind of like being goofy. And they didn't focus in on doing this very fine tool use skill until about 2 years later. So that's a developmental difference that without the kind of video and video analysis technology, we wouldn't be able to kind of understand those differences and be able to look at them in a comparative context to humans. Now, we've also focused on this type of research at the zoo, and I can show you some of that here. This was a chimpanzee group that when our new building opened in 2004 had never seen a termite mound before. So we built one into the exhibit. In fact, Steve had designed that in from the get-go. And we really wanted to see, okay, how quick will they learn this? How will it transmit? Those types of things. This is what the mound looks like from the chimp side. We baited it, not with termites, unfortunately, because our pest control guy freaked out when I suggested that. But with things like mustard and ketchup, which they like. And so I can show you a bit of what happened here. And so I think the very first day, they came through, sniffed at it, walked away, and we were kind of like, wah, wah, that wasn't very interesting at all. But they came back about 20 minutes later and very, very quickly picked up this behavior. And we ran the study with them for about a year. And then, as Steve mentioned before, we like to do everything in the building comparatively with gorillas. So then we shifted over to gorillas. Now, gorillas are not known to use tools in the wild, hardly at all. But we found that our gorillas at the zoo were quite willing and able, some of them, to perform this behavior as well. So those are the types of things we like to do is take something that is well known for chimpanzees, see what our chimps will do, but also compare it with our gorillas. And this is a fun thing, as Steve said, and all of the kind of experiments we do with them, voluntary, they can walk away at any time, it's very enriching for them. I mean, they love to do this. And it's also a neat thing for us because it's on display to the public. So the public can see that these are, you know, complex animals that are solving complex tasks. I think you're next. Oh, yeah, that's me. Okay, so the next thing, the next area of research that's quite a hot topic is looking at these cognition and kind of the social ability, the minds of these animals in a social context. So chimpanzees have a social system that's quite complicated. It's called fission fusion. And what that means is that they live in a community of about 30 to 100 individuals in the wild. And those community members kind of have an identity. They belong to that community. But their kind of traveling group size, or party size is what we call it, is variable throughout the day. So for example, when I'm following maybe a female chimp and her kids, she might wake up by herself, and then she hears, you know, some pant hoots over here. She joins up with another female, they groom, the kids play. Then she might hear a hunt behind her and say, oh, they're hunting something, let's go see what's going on. A big group of chimps gathers, then they break off into little sub-parties, so it's very fluid. And that means they're not with the same individuals every day, and yet they need to manage their social relationships quite carefully because there is a very strict dominance hierarchy among the males. There's an alpha, you know, a beta, and there are dominance relationships between the females. So, you know, you probably have some sort of those relationships at your workplace or wherever you are. You know somebody's dominant to another. But imagine kind of trying to get the social pulse of your workplace if you're only there once a month or once a week. So despite that fluid nature of their social interactions, they really have to monitor and manage a lot of these social things. One of the things people have been very interested in is if they have a trade economy. So it's similar, just in simple concept, to you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In this case, some people think they might scratch your back, and then the next time I hunt, I'll give you a piece of meat. Okay? So they think that they might have the ability to kind of cross over in the trade items that they trade. So grooming for meat, for example. So let's look. First of all, let's look at a hunt. This is one of my favorite videos. There's also debate of whether hunts are coordinated. So if there's blockers and chasers and things like that. What we're talking about hunting here is other monkeys. So a lot of people don't know that, but chimpanzees do eat meat. In fact, they'll eat anything they can get their hands on pretty much. Where I work and where this video was taken, they often hunt red colobus monkeys, so another large primate. And you've got to follow this pretty closely. So there's a male chimp running up, attempting to grab colobus monkey. He jumps away, he fails. He goes back up again. Got something. Now these colobus monkeys are mounting kind of a counterattack. They don't want to be caught. I mean, it's quite tricky to catch them. And so there's often chimps up and, you know, multiple trees around them. It's not clear yet whether it's coordinated or not. Here you can see another clip. This is believing this is through the full colobus monkey. And finally, he's going to come down with them and come right to the ground. So as I said, there's a debate as to whether this is coordinated. Some places where chimpanzees are studied, there are publications and evidence that there is a chaser and blockers and individuals cutting off escape routes. In other places, for example, where I work, it really looks like it's every chimp for himself. Everybody's going after the monkey, and just kind of the best hunter gets it. But what's interesting is that after they come down, they do tend to divide up and share this meat. And the reason why it's interesting is that an adult chimp can easily eat a juvenile to adult colobus all by themselves. Meat is highly favored in their nutritional standpoint. There's not a lot of animal protein in their diet, so they could easily eat that all by themselves, but they don't. They divvy it up. You can see here we've got somebody with Frodo, it looks like, with possession in the bottom left corner. All these other chimps gathered around, they're begging from him, and he's going to parcel out bits of meat. There's been a lot of studies looking at who does he share it with? Does he just share with his mom? Does he share with the guy that groomed him most recently? Does he share with the female he had sex with last week? I mean, these are all things that people have looked at. In this case, the best studies that have been done kind of take away the cognitive magic and suggest that they just share with the most annoying beggar. They're just paying them off, getting them to go away so that they can eat what is left. So in that case, it's not such great evidence for complex cognitive calculations, except that if I give this guy meat, he's going to go away, and I'll be able to eat in peace. So again, for you parents out there, that probably seems familiar. We have not in particular studied hunting to a large degree in the sense of who shares with who, but zoo apes do hunt. This is work actually that Steve Ross led, and we looked at catching and hunting of local wildlife across every AZA zoo that holds chimpanzees. And they do hunt. They don't eat them, as I remember. They just do it. And one of the reasons we included this picture is we just like it. We think it's pretty cool. So this is a chimp that has run afoul of a fowl. And the chimp won. We have other pictures of chimp versus possum and other things where the chimps don't win. But this hunting thing was quite interesting to us in a zoo setting because theoretically they are getting their complete diet and not needing to hunt for other animal protein. Another idea that is being explored quite a bit in this area is stress and social behavior. Things like, do you have less stress if you have a lot of grooming partners? Do you have less stress if you have a lot of social support? There's a lot of human studies that suggest this is the case. People with large supportive social networks are actually less stressed. And you can measure that in humans and in chimps by measuring cortisol, which is a stress hormone. In humans, you typically get that from blood or saliva. We can't do that with wild chimps. That wouldn't go over well. But you can get it from their feces. So chimp poops in the forest, you can pick it up and figure out a couple weeks later back at the lab theoretically how stressed out they are. And this is research that's actually ongoing right now. I have a graduate student at the University of Chicago who's interested in the relationship between play and stress. So play is a very interesting behavior in terms of animal behavior because nobody really knows what it's for. There's not a lot of good experimental quantitative evidence for why animals play. People have said, well, it's practice for hunting, it's practice for mating, but there's various debates about that. So I have a student actually right now who's working on following wild chimpanzees at Gombe, documenting their play, and then picking it up every time they go to the bathroom and quantifying their stress levels to try and understand that relationship. Chimps are a great model for this because they are one of the more playful primates. So I thought I'd show you an example of that. So this is a tough dissertation project. I mean, this is what Matt goes out every day to watch, is Ring Around the Rosie and chimpanzees. Now, Bob's on his committee, so I assure you it's quite a serious project, but we do get some fun video out of it. This is what a boy would typically do when his mom's termite fishing. Just do somersaults like that. So it's rough, the life of a graduate student. I think that's you.
You know, a couple slides ago, if you guys were paying attention, Elizabeth was talking about these ideas of cooperation and whether or not chimpanzees use cooperation when they're doing these very complex hunting behavior. And, you know, she correctly concluded that that while there's still some debate about it, I think some would disagree with this, I think there's starting to become this overwhelming evidence now that probably cooperation isn't necessarily part of these hunts, that there's much simpler explanations for how these hunting strategies go. But that, of course, doesn't mean, still up there? It really begs the question, though, if they don't cooperate when they're hunting, are they capable of cooperation? Maybe this is another one of these sort of holy grails. This is the thing that separates humans from animals, just like culture once was held up. Oh, this is a human thing. Animals aren't capable of that. Perhaps cooperation is another one of these. But of course, there are difficulties when you're relying on simple observational data, such as what you might get from the wild. And so we turn again back to a captive setting for an opportunity to investigate this type of question. And one of the nice things about the conference was that we had this combination, those who were studying chimpanzees in various captive settings in zoos and in research centers, and also those that were studying them in the wild. And the confluence of these types of perspectives really gave us some really neat discussions about what was possible and what chimpanzees were capable of. So we're looking here at a really what's become the classic experiment to test whether chimpanzees were capable of something as complicated as cooperation. And if you think about it, cooperation does involve a fairly high level of cognition. You have to understand, in order to cooperate with someone else, that they have thoughts of their own, that they are a separate entity, that they have their own intentions and their own motivations. That's the only way that you're able to have a shared perspective. So again, a Japanese colleague of ours came up with this great experiment to test whether chimpanzees were capable of cooperation. So I'll first try to explain this apparatus before I start the clip. See, there are two chimpanzees in this, what appears to be almost a glass box, and in front of them are two heavy blocks. Through those blocks, there's a long cord, and that's just a single cord that extends from one side into where the chimps are, then out through their enclosure, through those two blocks, and then back inside. If you imagine a chimpanzee grabbing one end of that cord and pulling, it would just slip through those heavy blocks and come all the way in. The need to pull those blocks towards them would require a coordinated effort, both chimpanzees pulling towards them at the same time. If one pulled too early or not at all, the blocks couldn't come towards them. In order to motivate them, this should be interesting. We have no screen up here. In order to motivate them, there is some food on top of the blocks, a little slice of banana. So you can see what happens. That first chimpanzee takes a look, holds onto the cord, but really waits to pull that cord until the second chimpanzee enters. And I can tell you that this isn't the 100th trial. Our colleague Satoshi Hirata told us that this was the third trial that they tried this. This is something that came relatively naturally to these chimpanzees. They understood the task fairly easily, and they had to cooperate in order to get that particular treat. So this has since been really coined as the classic experiment to demonstrate that they at least have the cognitive ability to cooperate in this way. The same thing? There we go. Well, I heard a few chuckles up there. And now we're going to talk about why you chuckled. Because this is a really important issue to us in terms of why we put together this conference. Both Elizabeth and I, we consider ourselves at least serious academics, and we're interested in scientific questions, but we also believe in the applied power of science and the ability to use science to inform policy. And what we really wanted to do with the book is not only report on what the contemporary research in cognition is, but how that research and how those findings could be employed and used in the world of ethics and care and conservation. So there is, the last section of the book has several chapters that cover that. And where are we? There we go. Chimpanzees, you may or may not know, are actually quite numerous in the United States. There are about 2,000 chimpanzees in the United States. That's several times more than is found in the entire country of Tanzania. where wild chimpanzees are supposed to be, where Jane Goodall has done her research. And so they're quite prolific here. And you'll see by the chart that I've outlined here that they're not in just one place. The research that we do, obviously, we provide them with enriching environments, good social groups, but you'll see that chimpanzees in AZA zoos actually only make up 13% of the overall population. In fact, most chimpanzees live in research facilities. A lot of them also live in sanctuary settings. That's the green pie section. But perhaps most troubling is the purple slice there, and these are what some might call privately owned chimps. It's perfectly legal to own a chimpanzee as a pet in the United States. We're really one of the only countries in which that's possible and completely legal. Chimpanzees, as we all know it, I think in this room, are endangered in that they're very threatened in the wild, and Elizabeth will talk about that in a second. But under the legislation in the United States, actually, they're not considered endangered and therefore might be bought and sold freely on the open market because they are exempt from the Endangered Species Act. As a result of this, chimpanzees live in a great variety of what I would call suboptimal settings. They're not able to enjoy some of the social benefits, these challenges that they have evolved to need in terms of a large, complex social group, complex environments, and so on. And so I think it's very important to sort of use the type of knowledge that we're gaining through these cognitive experiments to help inform what policy might be in terms of how we care for chimpanzees and perhaps how chimpanzees should be housed in the United States. Since we have a video for everything, I'll show you this video, and hopefully we hear no chuckles on this one. Because unfortunately, this is a video just taken last year, and to surprise all of you, this type of thing still goes on today. Chimpanzees that we now know through our research are able to be highly complex and highly cognitive beings that have a range of emotional capabilities and a range of intellectual abilities are still used in this way, portrayed sort of frivolously and often subject to adverse training to make them perform this way. So although this talk is generally about science and sort of the academic value of this type of research, there's ways that that research can inform how we react to these types of conditions for chimps. Lincoln Park Zoo, again, I think is taken a real leadership role here, not only in the science of ape cognition, but in the science of policy about things like chimpanzees. This is a project that started a couple years ago. It was called Project Chimp Care. We've got a website that you can see. We've got a Facebook page that you can visit, as is the case now. But really what it is an assessment of where these chimpanzees are throughout the United States. For many years, people had no idea that the person down the street owned a pet chimpanzee. In fact, you may or may not know that there is a privately owned chimpanzee living in the city of Chicago. And so these conditions exist, and those of us who have the impetus to learn more about chimpanzees and their needs might express our opinions about how these chimpanzees should be housed. Project Chimp Care has not only been involved in the assessment of these places, we go around, we sort of see where these chimpanzees are housed, but we've also acted as a middleman to transfer chimpanzees from suboptimal housing into conditions in which they're able to live with other chimpanzees under much more appropriate conditions. And over the past about year and a half, we've had about 18 chimpanzees that we're able to transfer from a life as sort of performers or as pets into sanctuary or accredited zoo settings.
The other issue here is, of course, we know about the amazing capabilities of these animals. We know how socially complex they are. We know how much they are like us, but we also know that they are disappearing in the wild. Quite interestingly, there's a strong link between, we now know, thanks to research that Steve led, there's a strong link between those inappropriate portrayals, so those career builder commercials, those greeting cards, and the general public's conservation assumptions. So Steve showed in a great paper that in surveys of people who visited Lincoln Park Zoo, they were asked whether these three animals are endangered or not. It was a gorilla, an orang, and a chimp. And a statistically significantly higher group of people said that chimpanzees were not endangered. And when we asked them why, they said, well, they're on TV all the time. How could they be endangered? You wouldn't put an endangered animal on TV. So there are quite strong linkages here, and in fact, Project Chimp Care, another thing it's doing is fleshing out that survey and trying to understand more about what is it about these portrayals that make people have those assumptions. So the reasons that chimps and many other animals are disappearing in the wild is specifically for apes. There's really three big ones. There's habitat fragmentation. Their habitat's just being taken away. That's why you see this tree fall here. There's disease. We know now that many primates, and especially chimpanzees, can catch a lot of the diseases that humans can catch them from humans, in fact, and also the commercial bushmeat trade, and that is the hunting and sale of animals for meat not in terms of sustainable terms, in terms of local people feeding themselves, but in terms of selling them to the highest restaurant bidder in the city as a delicacy. So the unsustainable hunting of chimpanzees and other apes for bushmeat. So again, the zoo is involved in several of these issues in a couple of ways. One project that I'm in charge of is actually looking at health and disease status of the Gombe chimpanzees in Gombe National Park. These are the chimpanzees that we know the most about in the world, in the wild, and yet when I started this project in 2004, we knew very little about their health. So to explain what's going on in this picture, this is the same chimpanzee on the left and the right. For those of you that follow Jane or the Gombe chimps, this is a chimp named Fifi. She's probably the most well-known wild primate to the general public. And the picture on the left was during an epidemic that we have since found out was scabies, or the mange. I'm happy to report that the picture on the right was taken after that. So she did grow back all her hair, became beautiful again, had another baby. She did, however, lose the infant that she was nursing during this outbreak. And the issue here that we have with wild chimpanzees and studying their health is we can't do blood draws, we can't take blood pressure, we can't kind of get our hands on them. They're wild animals to really identify pathogens and to figure out where they're coming from and then to prevent them. So the mange we found out from samples from animals that were deceased actually came likely from a dog. And so somehow dogs were coming into the park. We've since put GPS collars on all the dogs around the park to try and figure out which dogs are coming into the park and how they're getting into the park and why they're coming into the park. So that's an example of how we have to take a very atypical epidemiological approach to understand health in wild chimpanzees because we can't submit them to the regular tests. So that's a project we've had ongoing since 2004 in cooperation with the Jane Goodall Institute to really understand the causes of ill health at Gombe and to try and prevent them. As part of this, we work with a very large field team, and I'm not there all the time, so we have a very strong team on the ground of Tanzanian staff, and as part of that, we also do a lot of training. So this is one of my favorite pictures because this is a training we did on how to do a necropsy, or an animal autopsy, if you will, after an animal is deceased. This you want to do very carefully on a primate because, as we said, they can get everything we can get and vice versa. So cutting open a wild animal that can have who knows what emerging infectious disease, you need to do very carefully. So we were impressing this upon them and training them how to do this. They got it, but they weren't really happy that it was one of the hottest days of the year when we did this training, and they were in full Tyvek suits that just don't breathe, and it was a very sweaty day. But anyway, we got it done, and that's a lot of the aims of our conservation projects are to get the local people involved in the project and also train them to be able to eventually lead it. And we do have a Tanzanian project manager for this project. Now let's shift to the Republic of Congo, which I mentioned before. That was the honey pounding female up in the trees. This is where our other field project is located. It's in the Nuambali and Ndoki National Park, which you see here on the bottom. And the little red triangle is where that is. This is where those Central African chimpanzees are that nobody knows anything about. And the threat here is logging. And so in the triangle where it's red is protected from logging, but all around the triangle is a logging concession. So what our researchers there have done is set up line transects. That's a method to count chimpanzees and gorillas, both in the protected area and in the logging concession. So they can actually compare for the first time what the impact of this reduced impact logging, that is the Forest Certified Council logging that you see at Home Depot, that's the wood you're supposed to buy. What is the actual effect of that selective logging on ape populations? Can it be sustainable? Will ape populations be able to either move away from the logging and come back in, or just live alongside it? And that's research that's ongoing, and it's really exciting because it could very much potentially change logging policy all across Central Africa. The other thing that this site and our researchers there have done particularly well is the use of new technology. That triangle doesn't look very big, but it's actually a huge area. It's much, much bigger than Gombe National Park, where we just follow chimps around on foot. And because they want to keep a small research presence there, they've employed the use of motion-triggered video cameras. So instead of Elizabeth following around chimps to watch termite fishing with one video camera, which is inefficient now comparatively, they put 17 of these cameras out at termite mounds, and not only were able to understand more about tool use, but also count animals that way and get to know individuals that way and find out how many chimpanzees are in that area. For comparison, Gombe National Park, where I work, has 3 communities of chimpanzees. Dave and Cricket, working in Gualogo Triangle, think they have 13. So there's loads of chimpanzees there, and interestingly enough, these chimpanzees live sympatrically with gorillas, so they're overlapping 100% with gorillas, to the point that they're feeding in the same tree sometimes. So this is a really, really high priority area for ape conservation, but also our understanding of, so how do these chimps deal with living with gorillas all the time? And just to show you kind of how great this technology is, and this is the clip we'll end on. This is an example from one of Dave and Cricket's motion-triggered video cameras. So you can think about the cognitive implications of this as well. They're at a termite mound, so they've got tools. So when you're a chimp and you see something new and you don't know what to do about it, you try and probe it, and you try and probe it in a very safe way. You want to use your own finger, use a tool. It's classic chimp behavior. I don't know what this is, I don't want to touch it myself. I'm going to use a tool. And hey, look at that, I've got one in my hand. Now I'll use my finger. Now I'll use my finger. It's not so scary now that I figured that out. So this is really, really innovative technology. Since Dave and Cricket started using these cameras, field sites all over have realized, wow, the assumption was that chimps would tear them off the trees and tear them apart and ruin them, and it's a waste of money. But now places where there aren't long-term field sites, they're putting them out to be able to try and figure out what the apes are doing there. And so this has really, again, changed our understanding and changed our ability to understand chimpanzee behavior in the wild, and how these complex behaviors like tool use are implicated in their cognition. So that is our last bit, but we just wanted to, again, thank you all for coming and for hearing about the work that's being done in chimpanzee cognition and welfare and conservation, and also hope we gave you a little bit of a taste about what's happening just right down the road. And as Steve mentioned, some of that is actually on view of the public quite often, so you can stop by and see us. And if you're interested, you can get the book as well. So thank you very much. Which chapter is that? Which chapter is that? 4? Yeah. I believe that's chapter 4. No, that research is going on at Yerkes National Primate Research Center. A guy named Bill Hopkins is quite involved in that, and what he's done is done those types of imaging studies, both in terms of tool use and what brain areas are activated during tool use, and also gestural communication. And that is covered quite a bit in the chapter he contributed to the book. Similarities and differences, especially in the gestural realm. Yeah, because chimps, obviously, they don't have the vocal cords we do, even though mine are going right now. They don't have the vocal cords we do, so they use gesture in a much more fundamental way than we do. Wow, I'll stop here.
The chimps at Lincoln Park that you introduced to the artificial termite hill, were they wild born or they were born in zoos?
You can take that one.
Sure. Yeah, we actually have a number of chimps at Lincoln Park Zoo. Almost all of them are born in zoos, but we do have a couple of wild-born chimps as well. The ones in the video and the ones in the study that we were describing were all captive-born. And in fact, they came from a different zoo where they didn't have access to any of these types of tasks before, so we consider them naive to those tasks.
And how long did it take them to figure it out?
The females, day one.
Day one for the females. In fact, the male was the first. In defense of males, the male, the first one to at least look into a hole
Well, that's...
was a male. After that, he was left far behind. But eventually, they all learned it, and I think over the course of maybe a week, all of them learned it. The gorillas, as she mentioned, also learned it, but at a much slower rate.
We think, though, that wasn't the gorilla's cognitive inability to solve the task. We actually think that was that their social structure, which is different from chimps, was an impediment. So if there was a dominant animal on the termite mound for gorillas, we think the other animals just wouldn't even attempt it. So it transmitted much more slowly. Let's go in the back. Yep.
You know, any of these kinds of experiments are being done with other social animals that are not chimpanzees or primates, like wild dogs and wolves.
So the question was, what other animals do people do these types of experiments on? So tool use experiments have been done kind of across the gamut of animals. The ones that are the really hot stars right now are crows and ravens. Crows can do amazing things with tools. They've been studied in captivity. In terms of the social domain, people are beginning to ask these questions in the social canids. So wolves and wild dogs, as you mentioned. And then there have been quite a few elephant attempts at doing elephant cognition. It gets tricky with the trunk instead of a finger, so you've got to figure that out. And then there's a whole host of research specifically on bottlenose dolphins and other marine mammals, but bottlenose dolphins have been focused on the most for this in terms of a lot of video recognition, a lot of match to sample, those types of things. So these kind of cognitive tasks are being applied widely. They've certainly been most well studied in chimpanzees. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Right. And I think chimps are well studied because, as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of them and a lot of different studies. But by no means do I think chimps are unique in these qualities. I think we're scratching the surface across the animal kingdom of some of these abilities in other species. Yep, down here in front.
A couple questions. If you're collecting chimp feces or looking for and so on, you can certainly look for infectious agents too.
Right.
Is that being done?
Yeah, so when a chimp poops in the forest, there's about 6 different vials that immediately get popped out, and depending on how big the poop is, we debate whose vial gets full. So, seriously, and the dung beetles are there too, so it gets complicated. So we have a vial for parasites, a vial for bacteria, a vial for virology, a vial for endocrine, and then depending on there's certain protozoal pathogens that we do in a different solution as well. So the thing that's been really neat in the last 10 years with the non-invasive health stuff is the diagnostic capabilities from feces have exploded. You used to only be able to do parasites from feces, but now every 6 months there's a new virus you can actually get reliably out of feces. So as all of those come out, we add another vial and try and figure out what's going on.
The other question, when you showed the videos of the chimps using computer screens, it looked like those screens are always protected by a fence or something. Do the chimps break the TVs or what? Or the screens?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually we at Lincoln Park Zoo have experimented with a lot of different types of systems for fear of exactly what you're talking about. In fact, when we started using infrared screens in which there's almost an invisible grid of lasers that they had to touch a screen and that would break the grid, so there was no chance that they would break anything. That proved to work, but not as well as we'd like to. The setup they have in Japan is that there is that Lexan barrier. They're forced to put their hand under it so they can't get any momentum, because they would. What we use currently at Lincoln Park Zoo is another system altogether, where simply the touch is much more like what we all use at a bank teller machine, but it's protected by mesh in front of them, so they're pointing through the mesh. To give them a touchscreen that isn't protected at all, it could prove costly after a while. Yeah.
Yep.
On the cognition experiments in Lincoln Park with the gorillas, is that data, are they narrative?
Sure. Yeah. So right. So she was asking about the cognition experiments at Lincoln Park Zoo with the chimpanzees and gorillas. If it's completed, if it's finished, and I can assure you, it will never be completed. As long as I need a job, it will never be completed, and as long as there's questions to ask. So the cognition program that we have is sort of our broad umbrella term for just the program itself, but within it, of course, we have several sets of questions. So what you saw here was some questions about sequencing and how high, can they go, how many different items can they organize, but we also do experiments on other things. Program that we have right now is actually looking at eye gaze and the use of that as a social cue. So if I look quickly over there, a lot of you will probably look over there as well, wondering what's over there. This is a known social cue. It's also been proven that chimpanzees use that cue through these touchscreen experiments that they've done with them, in which there are eyes projected on the screen that look one way or the other, and chimps are then asked to make a choice and see whether that eye shift influences their choice. We're doing those experiments at Lincoln Park Zoo, but we have the unique ability to study it not only in chimpanzees, but with gorillas. And of course, there's very little known about gorilla cognition. There's tons of chimpanzees in labs across the United States, but no gorillas. So we're one of the very few places in the world that does any cognition experiment with gorillas, so we're interested to know if those social cue effects are in play with gorillas as well. It.
Oh, you're going to break his heart.
She asked which species has done better in the sequencing task, and I reluctantly admit that our gorillas have done better than the chimpanzees. We have several gorillas who have done very well and able to sequence. I believe Kathy's here, 8 items perhaps. One of our young gorillas can do that. I would assert, though, that the jury is still out because I'm a staunch chimp advocate, and the problem, of course, comes with making the appropriate controls. The gorilla subjects tended to be younger, more food motivated, and so on. So I think we continue to ask those types of questions and ask them in different sorts of ways as well.
But the gorillas have surprised us, certainly.
And actually, to follow up on that point before we get to the next question, Elizabeth mentioned before about how gorillas might have been impeded by their own social structure in the social task, right? This ability to learn from each other to termite fish. So if that theory is true, we would imagine that gorillas would do very well in tasks where social learning is not necessary, like a touchscreen task, and indeed that's what we're seeing. So I think it further bolsters our hypothesis that maybe gorillas aren't the dumb cows of the ape world that a lot of people thought they were, I thought they were, but in fact they're impeded because they're just not comfortable getting shoulder to shoulder with each other, and so social learning isn't a particularly good vector for them.
You've had your hand up for a while.
Is there any evolution in tool use in chimps? They go from one level of tool use to another, like say early hominid?
Cumulative culture. Yeah, that's another hot topic right now. Is so can they improve upon a tool and make it better in later rounds? And I would say again on that, the jury is still out. There's been a couple of studies that have looked at that recently, and humans, especially human children, can do it, and the comparison between humans and young apes is always a valuable one, but it's tricky because of different rearing histories. So when humans are tested, they're tested in situations that are quite comfortable with their parents around. When apes are tested, they're asked to come away from their family. So it's definitely a next stage for that research, but it's being intensely studied at the moment, for sure.
Given where you are with your current research, what implications do you think this has on society?
Steve, you want to go?
On our society? I mean, where do you think this could take us, this information?
Well, we certainly, as we mentioned in the talk, think that given what we know about chimpanzees, we need to think very carefully about how they're treated in this country and in the wild. These are animals that, through the history of biomedical, space, behavioral, cognitive research, have contributed an immense amount of knowledge to our human condition, to our biomedical knowledge, to our cognitive knowledge, and in some cases they're just not being treated well. Chimpanzees are the only animal that is federally endangered in the wild, but not in the US. They're the only species that have a split designation in that respect. So I think it does speak a lot to how we treat animals in general, and especially an animal that has contributed so much to our scientific knowledge in particular. Also, the conservation implications run along those same ideas. We know that there's these amazing animals out there. We're discovering new things about them every year. One area that we didn't bring up, but that people continually study, is that chimpanzees seem to very successfully and predictably use medicinal plants. So there's implications there for human medicine, and it's just, if these different cultures of chimpanzees in these different communities disappear, those future discoveries will not be able to be made. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I almost feel like a role reversal here a little, but you know, when we were putting the book together, actually some of the reviewers of the book, early reviewers of the book, were very critical, I think, of our single species approach. This was a book about one species. And, you know, why weren't we writing a book about all cognition for all animals? And, you know, our assertion is that, A, chimpanzees are special. Chimpanzees are different. They are our closest living relatives. And as such, we can learn something different from chimpanzees about ourselves as humans than we could if we studied fruit flies, for instance. Then, as Elizabeth mentioned, they're special because of the way that they're treated in the United States, used in different forms. But also, we do tend to use chimpanzees almost as a flagship species, whether it's for conservation purposes or for advancements for other species. So quite often, some of the best studies that we've seen with other species that we talked about already, canids, crows or stuff, are based on experiments that have been sort of perfected with some of the great ape species. And so I think there's a range of reasons and implications of this sort of research, and that's sort of why we stuck with this single species approach.
It sounds as if there might be political factions arguing against classifying chimps as endangered in the United States. Is that true, and what are their motivations, if it is?
Well, well, you had a microphone, so I don't have to repeat. You're right. It's a completely political decision, and it's very clear and very openly discussed that the primary motivation for declassifying them out of the endangered status was because if you're an endangered species, you cannot be used in invasive research. So as such, the biomedical and pharmaceutical community lobbied hard to not have captive chimps as endangered species. Since that time, there's been efforts to reclassify it because one of the big, the major impetus for biomedical research on chimpanzees in the early 80s was for AIDS research. Since that time, the landscape of biomedical research has changed. We know now that you can inject a chimpanzee with HIV and they do not get AIDS. They are not a good model for the study of AIDS. And so the use of chimpanzees now in the United States has changed dramatically. There's been a breeding moratorium for longer than a decade. And in many ways, the biomedical industry is getting out of the chimp business. So we think maybe with that out of the way that there's now an environment where that can be changed and chimpanzees can be afforded the wider range of protections.
Oh, okay. To help conservation efforts? That was your question? What can you do to help conserve? What can you do tomorrow? Well, be careful the wood you buy, for sure. Definitely habitat destruction and deforestation is the biggest threat to the vastest number of wild great apes. The logging concessions across Central Africa are huge. They're being logged actively. There's very few of those that are Forest Certification Council certified. That is, there's logging concessions where they will clear the whole forest, just everything gets taken down whether they're going to use it or not. And there's forestry practices where they tag individual important trees and take them down one by one. It's a lot more expensive, and that's why when you go to Home Depot, that wood is a lot more expensive. So for you as a consumer, the best thing you can do is know where your wood comes from, certainly, and know your impact that way, and then also contributing time, money, or voice to a conservation effort of your choice. I mean, there's several good ones working on great ape issues, including Lincoln Park Zoo. Go ahead and repeat it, I think.
Right, so the question was about an age range, maybe an optimal age range for learning these tasks. In general, the younger the better. The young chimpanzee that you saw do very well in the sequencing task that lives in Japan had a very distinct advantage, I'd say, over many chimpanzees. His mother, named Ai, is perhaps the most proficient touchscreen user in the world. She's done some amazing things on touchscreens her whole life, and he was born basically into an environment where from day one he had at least visual access to what she was doing on the touchscreen. And I think there's every reason to believe that early experience with these types of interfaces probably has distinct advantages. We've also shown, though, on the other end of the scale that there might not be any sort of distinct endpoint. There was some literature for a long time saying that something like nut cracking, there might be almost a critical period, some people suggested, where they can't learn to do that certain skill once they've left adolescence. And for a while, the oldest chimpanzee to learn that particular skill was in their 20s, but most learned it much earlier than that. Yet at Lincoln Park Zoo just a few years ago, a 47-year-old male was taught using a human demonstrator how to learn to nut crack. So I think learning occurs through the entire age span of the chimpanzee, with particular emphasis very early.
And the other question is, I remember reading, there used to be a lot of research on orangutans, and I remember reading they had an IQ of about 80, but you haven't mentioned orangutans, and I haven't seen much orangutan research recently. In fact, the Lincoln Park Zoo no longer has an orangutan, and I was wondering about that.
There's still research going on with orangutans. You're right, it's not at the level of chimpanzees. Obviously, at chimpanzees, again, there's a lot more data out there because they're in so many different settings, including these 1,000 chimpanzees that live in laboratory settings. However, I can tell you that orangutans in this country have been studied, and I know there's active touchscreen programs such as at Zoo Atlanta, in which the orangutans use touchscreens out in their exhibit in this big fake tree. The degree of success of those types of programs is probably not as strong as maybe some of the chimpanzee programs, but it is still ongoing, and orangutans do represent a very interesting piece of the puzzle because they are different and from a social perspective.
I think one more question.
Well, it has to be Alan's
Yeah, I wonder, maybe you the trade, I'm not sure, but you pick up, or can you pick up, when you teach the tests, go through these different tests, do you find happiness, frustration, depression, when assuming the test subject has difficulty, is that just simply something that's so subjective?
Right, so the question was whether we see sort of the range of emotion that might be associated, could we characterize different emotions, different animals as they're involved in these touchscreen tests? Anecdotally, it's clear. Right? So just watching them, it's clear some individuals like it more, some get frustrated more easily, but we also are investigating sort of empirically. We're interested in whether we can identify behavioral signs of anxiety when they do better or do worse in various tasks. Chimpanzees and other primates show anxiety in a number of ways. One of the ways that we know that they show anxiety is this type of long scratching. So chimpanzee scratching is no unusual sight, but higher rates of scratching indicate a higher level of social anxiety. So we're measuring scratching rates in our chimpanzees and gorillas as they perform these tasks. And we're interested to know if they do worse in these tasks, if they're over-challenged perhaps, are they demonstrating that maybe they're a bit anxious? So there's sort of these academic, interesting intellectual discussions that can come out of that, but it's interesting mix of cognition and welfare research almost in the same pot.
No.
No. In fact, in many ways, sometimes we see almost the opposite. Sometimes motivation to do well is an issue. One of the challenges of doing work in a zoo setting is that these chimpanzees and these gorillas live in great environments, get all the food they want, nice, appropriate social environments, and so to put any effort into getting a frozen blueberry maybe isn't up their alley. So we are continually challenged by finding what they would like. Getting them to participate is easy. Getting them to sort of try at it is hard. So one of our best gorilla subjects tends to want dry pasta as opposed to frozen blueberries and stuff. So finding that is a terribly important part of the research.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I confidently expected that we were in for a treat this evening, and we have not been disappointed. And I particularly like the film clips that we saw, which really brought things alive for me, and I've learned a lot this evening that I didn't know before. I just want to leave you with one thought. Several years back, I had the privilege of going behind the scenes at Lincoln Park Zoo. And they have a program there of operant conditioning, of training the great apes so that they're much easier to manage in various ways. And it was really very cool to see a big silverback male gorilla putting his fingers one by one through the bars to have his fingernails clipped. And a macho chimpanzee peacefully sticking out his arm to have a blood sample taken. And this is really part of the in-depth approach to great ape behavior that characterizes Lincoln Park Zoo. And so if you haven't been to the new Great Ape House, I would suggest a visit. It's a treat, as was tonight's lecture. Thank you very much.